Hey guys, how's it going? This is John with the New Division, and today I'm going to show you how to create a very simple drum beat, but at the same time adding in some interesting elements that can make your drums sound a lot better. So, as you may have heard before in some of my videos, I like to separate my drum loops whenever I'm creating drums, but let's first get started off with a basic pattern in this view. What I've done here is I've loaded up a 707 kit. So all you need to do is, if you're in Ableton, just double click on 707 Core Kit. If you don't have anything on your channel, just double click it and then this will pop up. And this is essentially a starting point with a 707 drum kit. 707 is it's modeled after the Roland 707, which is one of my favorite drum machines of all time. I love it because it doesn't sound super fat and crazy like an 808, and it doesn't sound very 90s like the 909. The 707 has just a very unique and specific tone that I think is a great starting point. It doesn't have a lot of decay and release on the sounds, the transients, and it's just a great drum to layer with anything else moving forward. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we're going to create a very simple drum pattern. We're at 120 BPM right now. So let's go ahead and start creating this drum. Next up, we're going to add in some hi-hats. And one thing to note about drum programming is this little window down here called velocity. This is a very important window because you can do a lot of different types of velocity settings, or in other words, how hard a MIDI note is being hit on your keyboard or on your MIDI controller. So for example, if I were to just mute these for a second, and if we were just to listen to these hi-hats, what I've done is I've made the first hit at 100, then I've made the second hit at 67, and then so forth. And what that's going to do is it's going to make this sound that goes, which it's probably better if I just play it for you. Now, what would happen if I were to make all of these the same velocity? It would sound like this. Which is cool, but if you want to give something a bit more groove, you can experiment with different velocity patterns on each note. And so here what I'm doing is I'm just copying these four because that's kind of what I've set my velocity settings to. But I could maybe on this last one bring this one up a little bit, and let's hear how that sounds. Sounds cool. I kind of want this last one to hit a little bit softer so that we kind of get that really pullback effect that a live drummer would do. Maybe on this one I might bring that one up a little bit so we get that extra hit on this next one. And we could actually bring all of these up a little bit. So the way you do that is you just select everything here. You hold down Command or Alt depending on if you're on Windows or PC, and then let's hear how that sounds. So that sounds pretty good so far. Let's go ahead and turn the kick and snare on. We can add in some open hi-hats, which I think are not going to be triggered if I have this hi-hat on. So I like that initial pattern. So let's go ahead and delete these and then copy these. So that's sort of like our 4-bar pattern. We can add a snare roll here. With snare rolls, one interesting thing that you can do in Ableton is switch to the draw tool. So what you do is you select B on your keyboard, and then what we're going to do is we're going to slowly bring these guys up one by one. And that's going to give it a nice little snare roll feel where it's starting off kind of slow, or softer, I should say, but then it's increasing in intensity. So let's give it a listen. So to make it even more drastic, we could bring it down like this. Let's see how that sounds. So as you can hear it there, there's sort of like this little bit of intensity at the end. So you're kind of creating that tension with very simple velocity settings, which I think is, super useful. So let's go ahead and start splitting these drums, because it's not really ideal to work with each one of these separate elements all in the same track. So I'm going to call this one kick. I'm going to call this one snare. I'm going to call this one closed hat. And then I'm going to call this one open hat. And then all we do from here on is just remove every element that is not part of that group. So in this one, for instance, we're only going to have the kick. With this one, we're only going to have the snare. With this one, we're only going to have the closed hat. And on this one, we're only going to have the open hat. So now we have the same exact drum pattern, except now it's been split 4 ways, which gives us a lot more room for options in terms of being able to change the sounds, modify them, do really cool effects, and be able to create a drum group that is going to be sounding a lot more professional, not so basic. So let's go ahead and hear that and make sure that we got everything right. So one thing you might have noticed there is that the open hat sounds a lot more open now. And the reason that is because what we did before was we had the open hat and the closed hat in the same group. And what that does is it truncates the notes when they're together. But for the purposes of this video, we don't really need them to do that. That's more of a scenario where if you do have, like, let's say a live drum kit from an instrument like Contact, and you want that open hat to close really quickly as soon as the hi-hat kicks in, that's a good scenario where you should keep them together. In this case, we don't really need them together, but I mean, if you wanted to, you could come in here, just grab these notes and put them all in the same group, right? So you could just do this. But I personally kind of like the sound of it being nice and open, so. And if I did want to adjust this open hat for it to sound a little bit more, well, I guess you could say shorter in time, there are ways to do that. And I can show you guys a really quick trick. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're going to the open hat right here. And then we're going to essentially open the sample of this 707 open hat. And then as you can see here, this is the waveform of this guy that's being played. So as you can see it there. So let's say for sake of the argument that we wanted to reduce the amount of time or the length of this hi-hat, all we would do is click on this little icon that says one shot, and then we could make a quick fade by dragging this little cursor all the way to about this point towards the left, and then we can do a little fade out right here. And you see how the more you drag it and the more you play with the fade out, the more the shorter it gets. So in a way, you can achieve a similar effect. It's not exactly like the sound that you would hear if it was all in the same drum group, but this is still fairly close and accurate, and I personally really like it. So let's go ahead and start playing around with some reverbs to get this drum to sound a little bit more interesting and exciting, because right now it's pretty bland. There's not really a whole lot going on. And one of the things I like to do with reverbs is to set up different sends. And sends are essentially these groups or separate channels where you can feed this kick, for instance, into this reverb, which we're about to add right now. So let me go ahead and do that. Now, I personally am not a huge fan of the reverbs in Ableton. I think that they're pretty underwhelming, and there's some much better reverbs out there. But for the sake of this video, I am going to play with these reverbs, so that way you don't get confused when you see a reverb that you don't have or don't own that you have to pay $200 for. So we're just going to use the basic Ableton reverb for now, which again, I'm not a huge fan of, but it is what it is, and we'll make this work either way. So the first place that I want to add reverb to is the snare. So now that we've added this ambience reverb right here, let's go ahead and turn this up all the way to 100, or 0 I should say, and see what happens. So that reverb is pretty decent. It's a bit too boomy for me. So we're going to play with some settings real quick, because what we really want more than anything is like a reflection. We don't need a really long decay time. Decay time in a reverb just means how long the reverb is going to last. And generally speaking, for drums, you want them to be fairly short. What that does is it creates depth and it creates space. And this gives the illusion that the drums are actually in a recording room. So you see how long that is, and now we're going to bring it down to about this much. And that just gives the snare a little bit of life. We have it off. Sounds pretty cool. I like that. One thing we can also do is play around with the chorus. Chorus on this just adds a little bit of more width, which if that's what you're going for, if you want your drums to sound a little wider, you can play around with that. There's also the input processings where you can do a high cut or a low cut, and that just basically means that you can cut out highs and lows from the reverb, well, as far as the input is concerned. And then if you actually want to do more cuts, you can play with the diffusion network. Generally speaking, though, I don't like having a lot of low end on reverb, so I'm going to add an EQ after this. It's just simpler for me visually to use this EQ versus this little guy over here. So now that that's done, I'm going to call this verb snare. And then I'm going to do another one here that's going to be verb for the cymbals or the hi-hats. And then this one is going to be routed to this. So let's go ahead and add a different reverb with a different reflection time. So essentially what we're doing is we're setting up different reverb rooms for each element. So let's go ahead and try this drums room reverb. I'm not really sure how it sounds, but let's just try it out and see. So let's add this reverb to the hi-hats. It has a lot of decay, so I'm going to bring down the decay a considerable amount. So that sounds pretty decent. I'm going to bring the decay time down just a little bit more because I just want that reflection. I don't want people hearing that there's a reverb. You know, at the end of the day with drums, you kind of want to deceive the ear, and people just think that the drums sound awesome, but they don't really know that there's a reverb going on. So as you can see there, it's really just micro amounts of just kind of, you know, pushing up and down on your keyboard just to get like that right sweet spot where it doesn't sound like, oh, that guy slapped a reverb on it, but more so, oh, those hi-hats sound like they're inside of a specific drum room, right? And so that's kind of what we're going for. Now that we've done that with the closed hats, let's do it with the open hats too. And we're just going to feed it to the same send, because at the end of the day, these reverbs, you know, when you're doing it for closed hat or an open hat, you want them to sound like they're in the same space. Now, with that said, there is a scenario where you could say, well, actually, I want the open hat reverb to sound like it's a bit more in a larger room, right? So let's go ahead and try that out. Let's try a different type of room for the open hat just to see what that would sound like. Yeah, it's not a bad sound. It's a bit muddy. I'm gonna bring down the reverb just a little bit, but cool. So that sounds good so far. The kick, generally speaking, you don't want to put reverb on a kick unless you're trying to go for like a very specific 80s type of sound. But yeah, I generally speaking don't really add a reverb to kicks. If I do, it would be an extremely short reverb, but I don't think we need it in this case. So I think the next step here would be to start doing some EQing to the drums. So I think the first thing I'm noticing is the kick has very little low end, which is very typical for the 707, and that's why I love it, is because it doesn't have a lot of low end. It lets you just kind of get the sound, get the transients in, so you can hear it clearly without worrying about the mix. But now we can go ahead and start playing around with some of the mixing on it. So let's find the fundamental sub bass frequency for this kick, which I believe is, you want to be looking for the highest low peak in this case, which looks like it's right around 67 hertz. So let's raise that up by 3 dB. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. So that's already added quite a bit of low end. I really like that. Let's actually do 6. Yeah, that sounds pretty decent actually. Let's go ahead and take out some of the lows on this kick, some of the sub lows that we aren't necessarily audible, that aren't really going to be helping us. So all I'm doing is I'm just trying to find the curvature on this guy, and then just cutting out that lower part. The other thing I could hear on this is the highs around, let's see, where is this? 2000 hertz or 2K. We could bring that up a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. That's too much. Maybe 1.5. Yeah, I like that. You know, it kind of gives the kick a little bit of life, but also adding some of the lows, and it's just sort of, you know, giving the kick a nice body, which we didn't have before. So let's listen to the before and after. Yeah, so that sounds pretty decent. So I'm going to leave it with that, and let's hear it in context. Cool. So the next thing we're going to do is add compression. So let's go ahead and add a sidechain compression to the closed hi-hats. What this is going to do is it's going to allow us to give the hi-hats a little bit more groove. And what does this mean? Well, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be sidechaining the kick to the closed hi-hat. So in other words, every time the kick kicks, no pun intended, it will duck these hi-hats a little bit so that it almost sounds like it's being played live by a drummer. So let's go ahead and set this up. As you can see here, I'm going to the closed hi-hat. I'm adding a compressor. On this compressor, we can start off with the ratio of 4 0 0, and let's turn off EQ because I want to sidechain the entire band. I'm not worried about sidechaining a certain frequency. So the best way to do this is just to start off and pulling this all the way down, and then we'll work from there and adjust to taste. So I'm actually digging that so far. That was pretty quick and easy. If you want a little bit less compression, I'd recommend going down to 2. But 4 sounds nice. Might be a little too much, so I'm going to bring this up a little bit on the threshold. So that sounds really, really cool so far. I'm happy with that. We don't really need to worry about the open hat with regards to the sidechaining because the side chaining should really only affect the 16th pattern on the closed hi-hats. And at the end of the day, we're just trying to get this to sort of groove well together. So next part is let's do a little bit more EQing on the snare drum. It's got a little bit too much low end. And I think it could honestly use some compression as well, because it sounds a little light and weak. And again, we're working with a very simplistic drum machine, so can't really expect a whole lot out of it. For this one though, I'm going to be using the glue compressor, which is an SSL solid state logic style compressor. So let's go ahead and play with this a little bit. So what we've done there is just add a little bit of smack to the snare. It's a very simple compression. What we're doing is just reducing it by about 5 dB with a very simple attack, simple release. So it sounds really good. I like that. Now, one thing we can do to these hi-hats is they have a lot of release, they have a lot of decay. So I'm going to shorten them a little bit because to me they're just a little too airy. So let's go ahead and fade this out a little bit. Bring down this room reverb a little bit. And one thing we can do too is if we want to play around with the hi-hat pattern, we can add in a auto pan, which is going to allow us to do a stereo effect on the hi-hat. So let's check that out and see how it sounds. With the amount, you're just reducing the stereo width. So that sounds pretty decent. One thing I was just thinking about was, what if I actually didn't send the reverb, but instead I actually placed it before the compressor, and what that will do is it'll actually make the reverb sound a lot more like an 80s drum. We got to make sure to have our wet at 50 though. And then I think it'd be nice to add some crunch. So let's add a bit of saturation to the snare to kind of give it a little bit more bite. Sorry, I didn't mean to put that one. I meant to put this one. Cool, so that's adding a little bit of extra gusto, or whatever you want to call it, to it, gusto. Next thing we're going to do is group these drums together. The reason we're going to do that is we want to glue more of these elements with each other, and the easiest way to do that is to put them into a drum group, or alternatively, if you wanted to, you could create a drum track like this, and you could route this to this specific drum group right here. So they would end up coming here, but we don't need to make it complicated, so we can just have this go out to the master, and this guy will be fine on its own. So I'm going to add a glue compressor again, and then we're going to aim for around 4 to 6 dB reduction on the compressor. So let's go ahead and try it out. So as you can see, that glue compressor is adding a nice amount of just glueness to the whole drums. It's kind of making it sound a bit more cohesive, which is kind of what we're aiming for, right? I'm going to turn the release down a little bit and the attack a little higher. The higher up that you turn the attack, the more the release, the more it'll sound like it's taking a while for it to get back to its normal state. I'm going to leave it around there. And one thing we can do too, which is a really cool trick, is parallel compression, whereby we're using a dry signal and a wet signal to process this drums a little bit. Well, I'll show you in a second what it means, but essentially what we would do is create a dry chain and a wet chain. The wet chain would be the one that has the compressor on it. The dry chain is essentially the drums without any compression, right? So the best way to do this is we would set these parameters like this. And I know that this is a bit more of an advanced aspect of Ableton, but and it can be kind of frustrating to work with these guys because it can be kind of hard to get some of these things to work properly. But essentially what we would be doing is we would later be clicking on this top bar right here where that white line is, and we would drag this all the way to this side, and then this top one all the way to this side. And then that's going to create a wet and dry mix. So if we wanted to really crush now on this side, the compressor, and make it super compressed, we could do that quite easily. So may have actually done this the other way around, so let me fix that real quick. Just realized this is one of those things where can very easily go the wrong way if you're not doing it right. And there you have it. That's a very simple way to do a bit of parallel compression. The last bit on these drums is to EQ them a little bit to give them an extra bit of life. So let's go ahead and do some EQing to these drums. So here all I'm doing is just cutting out some of this low at around 30 Hertz. And then on the highs. So all I've done there is really not a whole lot. I've just kind of brought out the highs at around 6K a pretty wide Q that starts at around 1,000, kind of rolls off at 17K. And all that's doing is just sort of giving our drums a bit more, just a bit more life, nothing super crazy. And then one final trick that we can do is play around with, say, like the delay. And, you know, if you want to create different patterns really quickly without having to edit all the MIDI notes, we can play around with having the device on and off at certain points. So if you want to do something like this, so, you know, obviously if you do the patterns quicker, you're going to be getting much faster. Play around with the ping pong setting. Turn down the drive a little bit. And that is one simple way to sort of give your drum pattern some life. You can also add in the beat repeater for other effects. And there you have it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any questions about any of this, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll be showing some more videos on how to do different types of drum design. Thank you.